Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, on Wednesday remembered Mahatma Gandhi on his 150th birth anniversary and said that the leader pioneered successive non-violent movements that changed history, and his philosophy is at the core of the work at the UN. He added that the Mahatma's vision continues to resonate across the world. Born on October 2, 1869 in Porbandar town in Gujarat, Mahatma Gandhi adopted a non-violent resistance and was at the forefront of the freedom struggle against the colonial British rule with utmost patience. This led to India finally achieving its independence in 1947. Fondly known as Bapu, his unwavering belief in swaraj and ahimsa won him accolades across the world. Mahatma Gandhi's birth anniversary is observed as International Day of Non-Violence by the global community. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the Gandhian principles in today's world. Joining me on the program today are Shiv Shankar Mukherjee, former ambassador, Shakti Sinha, Director, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, and Shekhar Iyer, senior journalist. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Mr. Sinha, I'd like to begin the program with you. Let's first talk about the Gandhian ways and the kind of impact that he's had on the global community and global leaders.
Frank, Mahatma's impact is so widespread across. Even in the smallest of places you go, there will be people who refer to him. Specifically, if you look at the American context, even when the British press was laughing at him in the 20s, exotic figure. In the 30s, Churchill calling him that half-naked fakir, striding up the steps of the Viceregal Palace, etc. The American, what they then use the word Negro, now they don't use the word Negro, it's pejorative. The African-American community of America, a person like Du Bois, who was one of the foremost American intellectuals of the Negro community, along with George Washington Carver, was writing what the Mahatma was writing, how they could learn so much from him. He was the one man standing up to the rule of the colonial masters. From that moment onwards to now, and I just read an article today about Catalonia in Spain, where people are, Catalonia is parts of Catalonia trying to break away from Spain. They've had difficulties in that, their prime minister to run away, etc. Where even there people are saying, let's adopt the Gandhian method. The people in the West Bank and Gaza are talking about Mahatma Gandhi today. Nelson Mandela, of course, always referred to him. If you go across, I went to this little island of Bali, and there was this lady called Ida Bagus who set up a Gandhi ashram in the eastern side of Bali where tourists don't go there. So as I said, if you go across, and impact is so much that when we Indian government put up a statue of the Mahatma Gandhi in Washington DC outside the Indian embassy, they wanted to quote Einstein's famous lines that future generations will scarce know that this was a real person kind of a thing. He actually walked the earth. And US law prohibits any quotation of a person who is dead for less than 50 years. The Indian government persuaded and the US Congress amended its law to allow Einstein's quotation on Gandhi to be put. So just look at the array of Gandhian influences, Havel in Czechoslovakia. You can go across the world and you find people. And the fact that non-violence, which goes counter to everything that history has taught us over the last 5,000 years, has gained so much of traction. It is the Mahatma speaking today.
Sure. Ambassador, talking about the impact that he has had around the world, let me talk about Africa as a whole. You've been the High Commissioner in South Africa. You've been in missions in a few other countries in Africa as well, Namibia and Egypt and so on and so forth. So he's had a tremendous impact on the African continent, more specifically in South Africa as well. Something that the South Africans acknowledge, something that Nelson Mandela himself has spoken about very fondly and extensively.
Yes, before I speak specifically on South Africa, which stands out in my 40-year career as one of the greatest emotional experiences I've had, let me just carry on from what Mr. Sinha said. There is no life in the last couple of 100 years, I think, which has been put under the microscope, dissected, and written about and talked about than the Mahatmas. I doubt if anybody comes close. Because he was at one point, at one and the same time, he was a freedom fighter, he was a philosopher, he was a social reformer, In fact, when Charlie Andrews, his great friend, told him, why don't you stick to one, just be a social reformer and leave the freedom fighting to the rest, he said, I am what I am in different times and different, situations. It's like the fingers of a pianist on different chords. I can't change myself. So if you're talking of a global impact, let's just remember, without getting into details, because there have been probably 1,000 volumes still written about the details. If you think of a central figure of the 20th century, where movements around the world, whether it's social, Cesar Chavez with the farmers in Latin America, or with the oppressed of Africa, or the civil rights movement of America, or Václav Havel, as he mentioned, or Catalonia, which is now being written about, or whatever, somewhere the name of Gandhi comes up. If it's a struggle of the oppressed, if it's seen as a struggle for independence, if it's seen as a non-violent struggle, you'll find the figure of Gandhi. You'll find the resonance of Gandhi and Gandhi being spoken about. So in that sense, he becomes the central figure of the 20th century. In fact, Time magazine's man of the century was Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein had written that the greatest political person of this century is Mahatma Gandhi. So, I mean, we're talking of, I don't want to expatiate on that because it would be redundant. Talking of South Africa, I spent 4 years there. One of the great, feelings of satisfaction that I have is that I got to know the great man Mandela, who had by then handed over his presidency. But I can tell you, the 22 years that the Mahatma spent in South Africa has not been forgotten. The Mahatma, as much as in India, is a living figure in South Africa. In fact, in Johannesburg, and I'm very proud of that because I had something to do with it, there is the only statue of the Mahatma outside in a square where Gandhiji had his lawyer's office, and that's the only statue that I know of where the statue depicts the Mahatma in his lawyer's robes. I'll give you, Mandela spoke frequently about the Mahatma, as everybody knows, and he said, and he writes in his book, and he said many times that although he would have wanted the ANC to have followed the non-violent path, he had to depart from it for two reasons, he said. Basically, he used to mention lots of things, but basically two reasons. One was that the ANC, were faced with an opponent that was totally brutal, and that they decided at a point of time that non-violence just wouldn't work. And secondly, he used to mention, and that's probably typical Mandela, tongue-in-cheek, somewhat like the Mahatma himself, that Gandhi was a man without weaknesses. I had a lot of weaknesses. But two instances on a personal level, and then I stop. If you drive from Johannesburg to Pretoria, that 40-kilometer stretch is probably the most heavily traversed by vehicles in the world. And you'll see a big hoarding advertising of the most popular business paper, somewhat like our Economic Times. I think it's called Business Day in South Africa. And its motto, on top is its motto, take a stand. And below that is an outline of the Mahatma, with a stick. So that is the figure they could think of. And finally, something that comes from my memory from my time there. The ANC, of course, is the principal winning party, the party of freedom in South Africa, like our Congress used to be. And in the election that took place when I was there, in the province, as they call it, of KwaZulu-Natal, which is where most of the Indian community lives, 70% of them live in and around Durban, which is the capital. The premier, which is like our chief minister, was a man called Sbu Ndebele, who had organized a poster campaign which had Mahatma Gandhi's face, and below that a slogan that said, who would he have voted for? Obviously meaning the ANC. And the other party, which is basically supported by the whites, protested and said they would take it to their election commission, saying that, they can't, the ANC can't just grab Gandhi as their emblem. Gandhi belongs to everyone, Well, the ANC's use of that on its posters is therefore a violation of whatever their code of conduct was. Next day, Ndebele's statement was widely reported in the press. I think maybe it was even an article by himself where he flatly said that this is all rubbish. The ANC is Gandhi. The ANC was created by Gandhi. It is Gandhi's ideals that form the basis of the ANC, and we will use Gandhi's name as much and whenever we want. You know, the passion behind that statement was very clear. So, in a sense, his name still evokes that kind of fervor.
Right.
That you can imagine. I mean, we can only imagine, what lay behind the struggle for freedom.
Sure.
So, as I said, his theatre of action was South Africa and then later in India. But there's absolutely no doubt that probably if you think of one person who is the central figure, who looms large on the horizon of the 20th century, I think it's inconceivable that it's anyone else except the Mahatma.
Right, right. So, Mr. Raya, the Prime Minister has written a piece in the New York Times about why India and the world need Mahatma Gandhi and why in today's day and age too, he is still relevant. Your thoughts?
Yep, I think what Mr. Sinha and Mr. Mukherjee mentioned, particularly Mr. Mukherjee's vast experience in South Africa, I think the big question comes is, why is it that today world, even many countries who could not adapt to Gandhiji's approach to conflicts and conflict resolution, they were all struck by that one point which Martin Luther King mentioned, which is that we talk of love, we talk of commitment, we talk of trust in individual relationships. Now, can those trust and love, in the sense, as Martin Luther said, one which in which the Jesus preached, now can that be internalized for a political transformation? Can it be internalized for a social transformation? Because that was a question. And we just talked about Mandela. Perhaps when Mandela, talked of reconciliation and called upon the blacks to forgive the whites and move ahead and think of the future, somewhere along I think it had to do with the Gandhiji's basic trust, which is, because we tend to, separate our individual ways of relationships and way politics has to be, which is unfortunate, because that is why most often the politicians are accused of being double-faced or even triple-faced, that they have one for the individual relations, because we have often heard this comment, oh, he's a great leader, on personal level, but when it comes to their politics, it's different. But I think Gandhiji somewhere along tried to see that what was personal and what was public, I think the differences were very little and subject to interpretation. Otherwise, he firmly believed in what he believed, that whatever aspects of governance, see, that is the reason why when we are observing the 150 years birth anniversary, because today we realize that there is not an aspect of governance which does not draw inspiration from Gandhiji's approach, whether it is sustainable development, whether it is sanitation, whether it is providing drinking water. Now, these are some of the core issues of Prime Minister Modi, and his article today in New York Times reflects that look, these are the ways, and we have heard from many leaders, because it's no longer a protocol requirement that heads of state come to Delhi and go to Rajghat, because somewhere along, even through their years in their politics in their respective countries, they have heard about Gandhiji, they have read about him. Somewhere along he has given that message that it's possible if you can resolve conflicts through loving human beings and the humanity as a whole. Now, this is, of course, in today's time, there is not a single conflict which is being resolved in this way, because there is a lot of talk of domination and maneuvering and all that. This goes on, but yet somewhere along, as a human art, the human being as we are, we somehow tend to feel, can't this be resolved in a way where we can bring about that one-to-one connect as individuals, and why not as nations, as communities? I think that's the big message of Gandhiji, and he stands there. He's
Sure.
right, he's alive before us for this very simple reason, I feel.
Right. So, just taking off from where Mr. Iyer has just left, Mr. Sinha, 150 years on, and we are still talking about this man. this man that we can see in our daily lives, on our
Right.
banknotes and on everything else, this frail little man who has had such a huge impact on the world. What is it that keeps him ticking?
You see, one, of course, that Gandhi's essential message. You mentioned ahimsa. You mentioned swaraj. Third would be satyagraha. Now, even swaraj is swa. Swa is the self coming from within. Satyagraha. Initially, the word suggested to him by his nephew was sadagraha, good effort, as opposed to duragraha, bad effort. And Gandhi changed it, no, satyagraha. Again, the search from truth, the truth within. Now, that is an eternal message that ultimately you have to look within you and try to separate out your biases from reality. In other words, where does the reconciliation come in? You separate the action from the actor. So you condemn the action, you're not condemning the actor. So Gandhi is very clear that we hate the British Raj, literally. We want it out. He called it uncivilized. He called it all kinds of fairly non-parliamentary words for the British Empire, rightly so. But he was very clear, you cannot hate the British as an individual. So in other words, that feeling that ultimately it is a community of human beings. We have a common future together. We live with each other. If you are a deist, we believe in God, we are God's children. All of us are God's children. Which is why Gandhi could understand the situation of the other side with much easier. I mean, how would you be if you were in that person's shoes? See, you cannot have a compromise, you cannot have a reconciliation unless you try to understand the situation from the point of view of the other person. And that is the kind of message that Gandhi gives. The second message of Gandhi is very clear. Brute force does not remain victorious all the time. It is possible with sustained effort. Sometimes he was impractical about it, like his advice to the Jews during the Germany time of the pogrom. But the whole point he was making was he was prepared for the supreme sacrifice in the effort to get justice, in the effort to obtain the truth. Because for him, God, truth, justice, all mean the same thing. And that message, I think, that don't be overwhelmed by numbers. If you have faith in your cause, if you think you're on the right cause, if you're looking for the truth, victory will be yours. And which is why he'll remain not only relevant today, but like all great leaders of the past, saints of the past, whether it's the Buddha, whether it's Christ, the impact, of course, is much greater centuries down the road, not in the immediate future.
Right. So, Ambassador, you called him the figure of the 20th century, probably stands apart when you look at some of the others, leaves them all behind. But when we look at the 21st century, does he still kind of command the same kind of adulation, the same kind of respect in the 21st century? Have people started looking beyond the Mahatma now?
Well, Frank, I mean, that is a question, if you answer it honestly, which I'm trying to do, the answer is probably no. And I'll explain what I mean. The adulation is very much there. Gandhi is a figure that has, for very good reason, because there's nothing about his life or his works that is hidden from his own self and his writings, is a figure that is the object of adulation, as you said, and not just tremendous respect, but adulation and almost worship around the world. There's no doubt about that. There are any number of critics, there are biographies which, very carefully dissect what he did when he was in South Africa and made derogatory remarks about the blacks, and as he mentioned about his statement about, there have been any number of that has taken away nothing from the greatness of the Mahatma. But what I'm trying to say is that, down to the point where the head of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee once said, when he was asked about the fact that Gandhiji never got the Nobel Peace Prize, his answer was that, he explained that how, it basically happened. And he said the question is not whether Gandhiji can live without the Nobel Prize, Gandhiji's memory can live without the Nobel Prize. The question is whether the Nobel Prize can live without Gandhiji. So that is the level of adulation that he had. I don't think in today's world, in a small sense as a professional, I've dealt with today's world. I think Gandhiji is used as a perhaps as a fig leaf or a kind of facade to pull the wool over people's eyes, from everyone from authoritarian regimes to politicians out looking for popularity or for all sorts of populist measures in all sorts of countries and across continents. So I don't think the ideals of the Mahatma permeate the governments of the world today. Maybe somewhere there is a small country whose policies can be seen to be, whether they say it or not, can be seen to be something the Mahatma would admire. But I really don't think so. I think we are living in a world of nation states, democratic, somewhat democratic, authoritarian, evil, and the pursuit of national interest, regardless of ethics. This whole concept of means and ends, which was one of the fundamentals of the Mahatma's thought, I don't think matters so much to governments of the world today. So I think when they invoke the Mahatma, I'll put it bluntly, they are being hypocrites who are, using the name of the Mahatma to, whitewash not their evil deeds, but to give their deeds the color of acceptance, of ethical motivations. I mean, that's the way I feel.
Right, right. So, on the day of non-violence, Mr. Wright, when the world is looking at conflict day in and day out, there are little wars and skirmishes happening all around the world. Is there a message that can be taken out of the page or out of the book of Mahatma Gandhi which can be incorporated there? Or do these warmongers in other countries look beyond it and are not really bothered about any of this?
No, I must confess, you see, the problems that people have had in trying to emulate the Gandhian principles, because they feel that these principles can work only when you are strong, not when you are weak. Because the big, see, that has been a debate, and that was a problem in 1947 also. A lot of people who differed with Gandhiji then regarding matters connected to partition was about this, that unless you are strong, you are not in a position to be large-hearted. If you are weak, you will in any case appear to be large-hearted. I think this is something that has always been there in all the armed conflicts you see, whether it is distrust between North Korea and South Korea, or North Korea and America, or Saudi Arabia and Iran. Somewhere along there is so much of distrust which feels until I vanquish my opponent, I am not in a position to even start a dialogue. And this goes to even matters concerning the subcontinent or even our neighborhood, because the basic issue is this. Now, because the whole problem is, I think the test of a leadership today is also this, that we have passed through a lot of problems, and this appropriating Gandhiji has not been done now. It has been done all over the years. People assumed surnames through marriage, and they did that politics on that basis, which Gandhiji himself would not have approved. Because Gandhiji's message was that should send a signal to intercommunal marriage. But then it became a lot of politics. The surname itself was a politics that dominated decades. So there is a reason if we are seeing somebody is using it today, I think I must be candid enough to say this has not begun now. Because that, of course, it's a very, one can say that this is a very dishonesty if one does that. But then this dishonesty has to be converted into honesty. Now the question is, are people who are in power or who hold power able to at least implement some of the Gandhian ideals in terms of poverty elimination, in providing basic dignity of life to the poor? Because ultimately you can be tested on all the principles of Gandhiji, at least let us score on some principles. Because even today, if you look at the political statements being made, everybody is using Gandhiji to attack one another. No, we did better, they didn't do better, or we are actually implementing it, not others. Because there is a lot of intellectual dishonesty, Frank, I must say. If you have to analyze it, just don't do the current history. Just go through what has happened. We celebrate Gandhiji because that's the way we can forget him for the rest of the years. Because it's so difficult to actually apply those principles. And if you have to apply those principles, it has to start with the self, which is a very difficult task. It's easy to address seminars, it's easy to write term papers, easy to write even a book, but difficult to bring those principles to your actual life. I think that's a big problem today. That's a big challenge, which is a challenge not just to a politician, to every one of us.
Right. All right, Mr. Siddha, I've got time for one a final comment on the program. Close the show for us with your concluding remarks on, the way forward really as far as the world and the Mahatma are concerned.
I agree with Ambassador Mukherjee completely on how governments generally or regimes or establishments treat Gandhi. But I would go further. Gandhi is not for the governments. Gandhi is not for the establishment. Gandhi is for the individual, as Messiah says, and for the small communities. In fact, the whole Gandhian concept of democracy is a very highly decentralized democracy. In fact, he wanted to convene a meeting in 1948 to discuss government. And the whole idea was a large structure cannot be democratic. So I think for the communities, for the individuals, especially the smaller communities, the weak communities, Gandhi shall remain relevant for a long time to come. Because the message of Gandhi, the essential message of Gandhi, that you are the agent of change. Swa, you, the individual, from within you, you can do it. And if you get other people together, you can face larger bodies, larger organizations, much stronger than yours. And I think, so I am, in that sense, far more hopeful, far less pessimistic about the relevance of Gandhi going forward.
Okay, all right then. On that note, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it on this edition of The Big Picture. See you again next time.